UCC Performance Rules. Under the UCC, contracts seller's performance must be perfect with respect to the goods delivered in the manner of delivery. Imperfect tender is when the seller sends defective or non-conforming goods. Buyer's options upon seller's imperfect tender. Buyer can either A, keep and retain the delivered and sue for damages, or B, reject and reject some or all of the goods and sue for damages. The requirements are that a buyer who rejects goods must 1, notify seller of rejection in a reasonable time, 2, hold the rejected goods using reasonable care, and 3, give the seller reasonable time to arrange for removal of goods. If seller gives no information regarding removal, buyer can return goods to seller, store goods for seller, or resell goods on behalf of the seller for the seller's profit. Under an installation contract where delivery of goods occurs in separate lots, for the rejection, buyer can only reject a delivery installment if 1, defective substantially impairs the installment, and 2, the defect cannot be cured. Rejection is limited to the defective installment, not the entire contract. Buyer can only cancel entire contract due to a defective installment if the installment substantially impairs the entire contract's value. Under the UCC contracts, buyer does not officially accept until goods are delivered and she has the opportunity to inspect and or notify seller. Acceptance of good occurs if either A, buyer confirms acceptance, buyer, after reasonable opportunity to inspect the goods, indicates to seller that goods conform, or that she will keep them despite incompetence or non-conformance. Payment without an opportunity to inspect is not acceptance. If buyer accepts goods, she cannot later reject them. If the buyer is silent, buyer fails to reject or notify seller of rejection within a reasonable time. And revoking acceptance is when a buyer cannot reject after acceptance unless she discovers a defect. The requirements are that buyer can revoke acceptance within a reasonable time after discovering a defect if A, defect substantially impairs the goods of value and either the buyer accepts the goods in a reasonable belief that defect would be cured and had not been, or buyer was excusably ignorant of defect or reasonably relied on the seller's assurance that goods conformed. If buyer has notified seller of imperfect tender, delivery of non-conforming goods, seller may have the opportunity to cure. The requirements: seller can cure if 1, the seller gives buyer notice of intent to cure and time for performance has not yet expired. So seller must give buyer reasonable notice and deliver conforming goods. Seller has reasonable grounds to believe non-conforming goods sent would be acceptable. Reasonableness is usually based on seller's prior dealings with buyer. Seller will have additional reasonable time period to tender conforming goods. Note: buyer cannot compel seller to cure.